The halls of St. Jude's Hospital never truly slept. They hummed. It was a low, constant vibration made of 1,000 different sounds. The squeak of rubber soles on polished linoleum, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, the hushed, urgent whispers of doctors and nurses moving with purpose. The air itself was thick with the clean, sharp scent of antiseptic. A smell that promised cleanliness, but also whispered of the life-and-death dramas unfolding behind every closed door. In this world of controlled chaos, some people moved with the current, while others created their own wake. Dr. Evans was definitely a wake creator. He was a man in his early 30s, but he carried the authority of someone twice his age. It was in the way he held his shoulders, pulled back and confident, in the steady, unblinking gaze that made interns and younger residents fidget under its weight. His medical pedigree was impeccable, a list of prestigious universities and fellowships that he could, and occasionally did, recite with the precision of a man who had memorized his own prayers. He was brilliant, and worse, he knew it. This self-assurance manifested as a kind of impatience with the world, a subtle but persistent belief that he was operating on a higher plane than everyone else around him. He walked down the corridor not as a part of the team, but as its general surveying his troops. Trailing a few steps behind him was a younger doctor, a resident named Jeff, who was in his first year of surgical training. Jeff was eager, almost painfully so. He idolized Dr. Evans, seeing him as the future of surgery, the kind of doctor he desperately wanted to become. He scribbled notes on a small notepad, nodding enthusiastically as Dr. Evans spoke, his mind racing to keep up with the torrent of complex medical information being thrown his way. To be learning at the feet of a master like Evans felt like winning the lottery as they rounded the corner that led to the main nurse's station. Dr. Evans was in the middle of a lecture about a particularly difficult valve replacement procedure he had performed the week before. "You see, the key is not just the technique," he said, his voice a low, authoritative boom that cut through the hospital's hum. "It's the anticipation. You have to see the complication before it happens. It's a chess match, Jeff. Most people are just playing checkers." Jeff nodded, his pen flying across his notepad. Chess match. Got it. The nurse's station was a bustling island of focused activity. Phones were ringing, charts were being clipped and unclipped. The nurses in brightly colored scrubs moved in a kind of synchronized dance. At one end of the long counter, a nurse was standing perfectly still, a stark contrast to the motion around her. Her name was Amara. She was new to this floor, having transferred from another department. But her reputation for being unshakably calm and incredibly thorough had already preceded her. She was meticulously updating a patient's chart, her handwriting neat and precise. She held her pen with a relaxed but firm grip, her posture straight and professional. There was a quiet dignity about her, a sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Dr. Evans's eyes swept over the station. A quick, dismissive glance. Before landing on Amara, he saw a black woman in a nurse's uniform, and his mind, in its swift and unjust way, placed a label on her. It was an automatic, almost unconscious process of filing someone away into a box of his own making. He slowed his pace just a fraction, and his voice dropped. It wasn't a whisper, but a carefully modulated tone designed for his companion's ears alone. Though it carried easily in the relatively quiet corridor, he tilted his head almost imperceptibly in Amara's direction. "See, this is what I'm talking about," he said to Jeff, a note of cynical amusement in his voice. "The administration is so obsessed with filling their diversity quotas that they're forgetting what matters. It's not about how good you are anymore. It's about what box you check on a form." Jeff shifted uncomfortably, a flicker of something uncertainty. Maybe even pity crossing his face before he smoothed it over. He didn't say anything, just kept his eyes fixed on Dr. Evans. Desperate to appear as if he agreed, Dr. Evans continued, his smile tightening. "Don't get me wrong, I'm sure she's a perfectly nice person. Probably a real sweetheart. But you put her in a real code, a situation where she has to think on her feet and perform under real pressure. It's a liability. It's a joke for the rest of us who actually had to earn our spot." He let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound full of contempt, a small, ugly noise in the middle of the busy hospital. It was the sound of a door being slammed, a line being drawn. Jeff let out a weak, nervous chuckle in response, pathetic echo of the senior doctor's scorn. At the nurse's station, Amara's pen stopped moving. It hovered a millimeter above the page, frozen in midair. The words she had been writing evaporated from her mind. For a split second, the entire world seemed to fall away. The beeping monitors, the ringing phones, the hurried footsteps, they all faded into a dull, distant roar. All she could hear was that laugh, echoing in the sudden, cavernous silence inside her own head. A hot, prickly wave of heat washed over her, starting in her chest and climbing up her neck to settle in her cheeks. It was the feeling of being exposed, of being seen in the most unflattering and untrue light. She had graduated at the top of her class. She had spent years in the trauma unit, a place where a single mistake could mean the difference between life and death, and had earned the respect of every single doctor and nurse she had worked with. She had fought for her place, not with her voice or with demands, but with her skill, her dedication, and her unwavering calm under pressure. But none of that mattered. In the space of 5 seconds, this man, this stranger in a position of power, had erased all of it. He had reduced her to a color, a stereotype, a quota. Had looked at her and not seen a nurse, but a political statement. He hadn't seen a person who had saved lives, but an inconvenience. The injustice of it was like a physical blow, taking the air from her lungs. She felt an overwhelming urge to turn around, to meet his gaze, to say something, anything. But a lifetime of discipline, both professional and personal, kicked in. To react would be to give him power. To show that his words had landed a hit would be to let him win. Instead, she did the only thing she could. She stood there, a statue of professional composure, her back ramrod straight. She made herself take a slow, silent breath, forcing the air past the tightness in her chest. She forced her hand to move, lowering the pen back to the paper and continuing to write as if she had heard nothing at all. Each letter she formed was a small, quiet act of defiance. She would not be his joke. She would not be his quota. She was a nurse, and her work, which was about to continue, would be her only answer. The words hung in the air long after Dr. Evans and his resident had walked away. They clung to the polished floor and the beige walls like a stubborn film of grime that couldn't be wiped away. For Amara, the hospital's familiar hum had changed its key. It was no longer a sound of purpose and healing. It was a constant low-frequency reminder of the contempt she had just been served. Every squeak of a shoe, every ring of a phone, every hushed conversation now felt like it might be about her. The secure foundation she had worked so hard to build felt cracked. A cold draft was seeping through. She finished the chart, her movements now stiff and mechanical instead of fluid. The act of writing, which usually brought her a sense of calm order, felt like a chore. The ink on the page seemed to mock her, a record of her professional life that now felt tainted. When she set the chart back in its holder, she did it with a little too much force, the plastic clattering loudly in the station. A few of her colleagues looked up, their expressions a mixture of concern and curiosity. Amara offered them a tight, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a mask she had learned to wear in moments of stress, a simple curving of the lips that signaled, "I'm fine," without having to utter the lie. But she wasn't fine. A fire was burning inside her, hot and contained. A banked-down coal of anger and shame. She spent the rest of her shift operating in a kind of bubble. She moved through her tasks with an efficiency that was almost frightening. She administered medications, checked vitals, changed dressings, and comforted patients. But she did it all from a distance. It was as if she were watching herself perform her duties from behind a thick pane of glass. Her interactions with others were clipped and professional. She answered questions directly and offered no small talk. When a doctor asked for an update on a patient, she delivered the information with the cool, detached precision of a robot reading a datasheet. The warmth and easy camaraderie that usually marked her presence were gone, replaced by an icy wall of reserve. It was her armor, and she was not letting anyone get close enough to see the damage beneath Dr. Evans. On the other hand, seemed to exist in a completely different universe. To him, his comment in the hallway was a passing thought, a momentary venting of frustration to a subordinate. He was the sun around which this particular floor of the hospital orbited, and his casual cruelty was as insignificant to him as a speck of dust. He moved through his day with the same unshakable confidence, barking orders, making diagnoses, and accepting the deference of those around him as his due. He didn't notice the change in Amara. To him, she was just one of many faces in the crowd of blue and green scrubs, a background character in the movie of his own greatness. Late in the afternoon, the floor was hit with a rush of new admissions. The calm rhythm of the day was broken, and the pace became frantic. Amara was in the middle of juggling 2 post-op patients and a man with severe pneumonia when Dr. Evans's voice cut through the noise from the other side of the nurses' station. "You?" The voice was sharp, laced with an impatience that bordered on anger. Amara looked up from the medicine she was preparing. Dr. Evans was standing at the counter, pointing a finger in the general direction of the nurses. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular. He was looking at the group as if they were interchangeable parts in a machine he was trying to operate. "I need the Zoll monitor for room 408 now, and make sure it's been properly calibrated. I don't want any excuses or mistakes." He's unstable. He didn't wait for a response. He turned his back and began striding toward room 408, confident that his command would be obeyed instantly. The snap in his voice, the imperious gesture of his hand, it was the language of a master speaking to his dog. A hot surge of anger shot through Amara, so powerful it almost made her hands tremble. She clenched her jaw, the muscles in her neck tightening. Her friend and colleague, Maria, who was standing next to her, shot Amara a look of pure, unadulterated fury. Her eyes were wide, and her mouth was set in a thin, angry line. "Can you believe him?" she muttered under her breath, her voice a low hiss. "Who does he think he's talking to?" Amara didn't answer. She just gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The U in Evans's command had been aimed at all of them, but it felt personal. It felt like the follow-up to his hallway monologue. He saw them not as skilled professionals, but as a faceless service class, there to fetch and carry for him at his whim. The humiliation from before came rushing back, fresh and stinging. Taking a slow breath to steady herself, Amara turned and walked toward the supply closet. Her steps were measured and deliberate. She didn't rush. She was not his panicked servant. She was a registered nurse, and she would operate with the dignity of her profession. The Zoll monitor was a heavy piece of equipment, a sophisticated machine designed to both monitor and pace a failing heart. It was housed in a large rolling cart. She pulled it from the closet, the weight of it requiring a firm tug. She checked the connections and the display. Running a quick diagnostic to ensure, as he had demanded, that it was properly calibrated, it was a step she would have taken anyway, a matter of standard procedure and patient safety. But now, it felt like an act of defiance. She would not fail. She would be perfect. She would give him no reason, no excuse, to ever question her competence again, wheeling the heavy cart down the corridor. She felt the eyes of other nurses on her. They had seen the whole exchange. There was a silent, shared understanding among them, a look of solidarity that Amara felt, but didn't acknowledge. She kept her eyes fixed forward, her expression a blank slate. When she entered room 408, Dr. Evans was already at the patient's bedside talking to the man's anxious wife. He didn't look up as Amara positioned the monitor at the foot of the bed. With practiced, silent efficiency, she began to apply the electrode pads to the patient's chest, her movements gentle and sure. She connected the leads, her fingers flying over the buttons on the machine screen. A steady rhythmic blip immediately appeared on the monitor. The patient's heartbeat displayed in bright green numbers. Her work was done. She had completed his command flawlessly, without a single word. She picked up the patient's chart, made a note about the new monitor being in place, and turned to leave. As she reached the door, Dr. Evans finally glanced her way. He didn't say thank you. He didn't even make eye contact. He just gave a curt, almost dismissive nod in the direction of the machine. A gesture that said, "Good. You did what you were told." Then he turned his attention back to his patient. Completely dismissing her from his mind, Amara walked out of the room and closed the door softly behind her. The quiet click of the latch was the only sound she made. He had no idea. He had no idea that his casual act of disrespect had just been witnessed by the person whose opinion he valued more than anyone else's in the entire hospital. He had no idea that the diversity hire he had mocked earlier was the daughter of the man, whose name was engraved in gold letters on the wall just down the hall. Dr. Alistair Williams, cardiothoracic wing, and Amara, for now, was content to let him remain in his ignorance. It was a weapon, and she was not ready to use it yet. The last few hours of Amara's shift felt like they were happening underwater. Everything was muffled and slow. The fire from earlier had cooled to a heavy, cold lump of resolve in her stomach. She went through her final tasks, her hands moving automatically, while her mind was a million miles away. She thought about her father, about the countless stories he had told her about his own days as a young surgeon. He had spoken of the arrogance, the intense pressure, the constant need to prove yourself. But he had also spoken of the camaraderie, the profound respect for the nurses who were the true backbone of any hospital. He had taught her that medicine was a team sport and that every single person on the team, from the surgeon to the orderly, deserved respect. The contrast between the world her father had described and the one she had just experienced was staggering. Finally, her shift was over. She changed out of her scrubs in the quiet, empty locker room, the familiar routine a small comfort. As she walked out of the hospital and into the cool evening air, she felt a weariness that went deeper than just a long day at work. It was a bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying the weight of someone else's prejudice. She drove home in silence, the city lights blurring past her window. All she wanted was to see her father's face, to hear his voice, and to remind herself that the world still contained men like him, men of integrity and kindness. She was just sitting down to a cup of tea when the call came. It wasn't a phone call. It was the harsh, jarring shriek of the hospital's emergency code. BROADCAST, through a special app on her phone that senior nurses were required to have. It was a sound that instantly tensed every muscle in her body. On the screen, a string of terrifying words flashed. Incoming trauma. Multi-patient MVC. Code blue. ETA. 2 minutes. MVC meant motor vehicle crash. Code blue meant the patient was likely in cardiac arrest. This was the worst kind of alert. Her tea forgotten, Amara was already grabbing her keys and her bag. Adrenaline, pure and potent, flooded her system, washing away the fatigue of the day. This was her element. This was where all the training, all the experience, all the grit paid off. She was one of the first nurses to arrive back at the hospital, shrugging into a fresh pair of scrubs as she jogged toward the emergency department. The ER was already a storm of controlled chaos. Doctors and nurses were scrambling, pulling open crash carts, preparing intubation kits, and clearing space in the trauma bays. The charge nurse was calling out orders, her voice sharp and clear over the din. Amara immediately started helping, her movements a blur of efficiency. She was opening for kits, checking suction canisters, and laying out sterile drapes. She didn't need to be told what to do. She saw the gaps and filled them, coming in hot. A voice yelled from the ambulance bay doors. A gurney, pushed by 2 paramedics, burst through the entrance. On it was a man, his face pale as a sheet, his clothes ripped and bloody. A frantic oxygen mask was strapped to his face. A paramedic was performing chest compressions in a desperate rhythmic pump. The man's chest was a mottled map of bruises, and a makeshift bandage on his side was already soaked dark red with blood. Dr. Evans, drawn by the promise of a high-stakes, high-profile case, was already at the center of the trauma bay. His eyes gleamed with the thrill of the challenge. This was the kind of case that could make a career. "I've got this," he announced, his voice booming with authority as he stepped forward to take the lead. But then, a larger, more commanding figure pushed his way through the crowd. It was Dr. Albright, the chief of surgery himself. He was an older man, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, and a presence that instantly silenced the room. "Not this one, Mark," Dr. Albright said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. Dr. Evans's face fell, his confidence visibly deflating. But I can handle it. You're on observation, Dr. Albright? Cut him off, his gaze like ice. This is Dr. Alistair Williams. The name hit the room like a physical wave. Every single person in the trauma bay, from the most senior surgeon to the youngest orderly, knew that name. Dr. Alistair Williams wasn't just a patient. He was a legend. He was the man who had built St. Jude's cardiac program from the ground up. He had personally trained half the cardiac surgeons on the staff, including Dr. Albright himself. He was a generous benefactor whose donations had funded the very wing where Dr. Evans worked. He was, in every sense of the word, institutional royalty. To have him crash land in your R was every administrator's nightmare and every ambitious doctor's dream. Dr. Evans just stood there, speechless. The case of a lifetime, the one he had tried to claim, was being ripped from his grasp. He was being relegated to the sidelines. I'm leading this, Dr. Albright said, his focus already entirely on the patient. Get the OR prepped. Call the blood bank. I need a full massive transfusion protocol. And get me my best nurse. I need Amara now.
Ow.
The charge nurse didn't hesitate. She scanned the chaos, and her eyes locked onto Amara. Amara. You're with the chief. Go prep the OR. He wants you on this from start to finish. Amara nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her professional mind kicked in, processing the orders. OR prepped. Massive transfusion. Best nurse. But another part of her brain, a part that felt distant and disconnected, was stuck on one word: Williams. It was a common name, she told herself. It couldn't be him. It just couldn't. But as she turned and began to run toward the elevators that would take her to the surgical floor, she risked one last glance at the gurney. In that split second, a paramedic adjusting the oxygen mask moved, and she got a clear look at the patient's face. It was older, more worn, and covered in blood, but she would have known it anywhere. It was the face from the photos on her mantelpiece. The face from her childhood, smiling as he taught her how to ride a bike. The face from her graduation, beaming with a pride so profound it had brought tears to her eyes. It was her father. The world tilted violently, and a wave of nausea so intense it made her dizzy washed over her. For a single, terrifying moment, she felt like she might collapse right there on the floor. Every instinct screamed to push forward, to get to him, to be his daughter. But a louder, stronger instinct, one forged by years of training and iron will, took over. This was not the time to be a daughter. This was the time to be a nurse. This was her father's life on the line, and the best way she could help him was to be the calm, skilled professional that Dr. Albright, the man he trusted above all others, had just requested. She spun on her heel and bolted for the elevator, her face a mask of cold, hard focus. Her family emergency was now the hospital's most critical case. Her personal crisis was now a professional responsibility. And as the elevator doors slid shut, blocking out the chaos of the ER, Amara felt a transformation take place. The nurse was taking over, pushing the grieving daughter into a deep, dark corner of her heart where she could not interfere. Her father was now just the patient, and his survival depended on her being the best nurse in that entire hospital starting right now. The elevator ride up to the surgical floor was the longest 30 seconds of Amara's life. The air inside the small, enclosed space was thick and suffocating. She could feel her own heart beating against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird fighting to get out. Her hands were ice cold, and she clenched them into fists to stop them from trembling. The nurse she was supposed to be fought to maintain control, pushing down the tidal wave of emotion that threatened to drown her. She forced herself to take slow, measured breaths. Just as she would instruct a panicking patient, in, out, but the rhythm was fragile, and each breath was a battle. When the doors opened, she was met with the familiar, sterile quiet of the surgical ward. A nurse standing at the front desk looked up, her eyes wide with the news that was already spreading through the hospital grapevine. Dr. Albright's on his way up with Dr. Williams, she said, her voice hushed with urgency. Amara didn't respond with words. She just gave a sharp, determined nod and pushed past the desk, her long legs eating up the distance to the main operating suite. The doors to the prep room hissed open, and she stepped into a world of organized urgency. She stripped off her street clothes and pulled on a set of blue surgical scrubs, the crisp, clean fabric feeling like a uniform for a war she was suddenly, terrifyingly, in the middle of. She washed her hands, the scalding hot water, a stinging, grounding sensation that helped to focus her scattered thoughts. As she scrubbed, her mind was a whirlwind of protocols and checklists. She needed to make sure the operating room was set up perfectly. Every piece of equipment had to be in its place. Every possible contingency had to be anticipated. This wasn't just any surgery. This was for her father. Failure was not an option by the time she stepped into the operating room itself. She had locked the last of her personal terror away in a deep, fortified part of her mind. The room was a hive of activity. A surgical technician was laying out rows of gleaming, sterile instruments on a metal tray. An anesthesiologist was preparing his cocktail of drugs, checking the monitors and breathing tubes. Everyone was moving with a tense, focused energy. Amara moved to her position, her role as the lead circulating nurse clear. She was the conductor of this orchestra, the one who would make sure every musician had what they needed at the exact moment they needed it. She checked the blood products that had just arrived from the bank unit after unit of bright red life-saving liquid. She verified the patient's information on a monitor, her eyes scanning the name Alistair Williams without a flicker of emotion. He was not her father in this room. He was the patient in bed one. The double doors to the O are swung open. The trauma team burst in, pushing the gurney. Dr. Albright was at the helm, his face grim and set. The patient was pale and still, with a breathing tube already down his throat, connected to a machine that forced oxygen into his damaged lungs. Amara's heart gave a painful lurch as she saw him, but she fought it down, her expression remaining a mask of professional calm. "Let's move, people," Dr. Albright commanded. "We have massive internal bleeding. Let's get him prepped and get him open. Amara, are you with me?" "Ready, doctor," she said, her voice steady and clear, a sound that even surprised herself. The surgery began. It was a symphony of controlled chaos. Dr. Albright made the first incision. The moment the scalpel cut through the skin, a river of dark red blood welled up, filling the surgical field. The room's atmosphere grew even more tense. The beeping of the heart monitor became the frantic, urgent tempo of their work. Pressures dropping, the anesthesiologist called out, his voice tight. "Push another unit of Oneg," Dr. Albright ordered, his eyes never leaving the wound. "On it," Amara said. She was already at the blood warmer, her movements quick and precise. She hung the bag of blood, ran the tubing through the machine that warmed it to body temperature, and connected it to the patient's IV line. Her hands didn't shake. Her mind was a crystal-clear stream of information. She knew what the surgeon needed before he asked. When Dr. Albright reached for a clamp, one was already in his hand. When he needed suction, the tube was perfectly positioned. She was not just assisting. She was anticipating, flowing with his rhythm, making his impossible job possible. Dr. Evans, who had been relegated to a corner observation room, watched through the large glass window. He stood with his arms crossed, his face a mixture of envy and begrudging admiration. He had never seen a nurse work with such grace and speed. She was a ghost, silently appearing wherever she was needed, her presence a calming force in the center of the storm. The nurse he had so casually dismissed as an unqualified quota hire was performing at a level he had rarely seen, even from the most experienced surgical veterans. A seed of doubt, small but persistent, began to sprout in his mind. The hours ticked by. The team worked relentlessly, fighting to repair the catastrophic damage inside the patient's chest. They found the source of the bleeding a torn vein deep inside and managed to clamp it. But the patient's heart, weak from the loss of blood and the trauma, was struggling to maintain a rhythm. They had to use a defibrillator 3 times, each jolt making the body on the table jump with a violent, unnatural shudder. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bleeding was under control. The heart, though fragile, was holding its own. The pace in the room slowed from a frantic sprint to a steady, cautious jog. Dr. Albright began to close. His movements still precise, but less frantic. He looked up from the patient, his eyes meeting Amara's across the table. For the first time, he saw not just an excellent nurse, but a person. "I don't know where we found you," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion and relief. "But you are a godsend. The way you anticipated everything." Alistair would be proud. He didn't know. He was just using her father's first name as a term of respect, a figure of speech. Just then, the anesthesiologist spoke up. "He's starting to come out of it a bit. Doctor." "Light anesthesia." Dr. Albright nodded. "Let him hear us. Let him know he's made it." As they worked on the final sutures, a faint muffled sound came from the patient's endotracheal tube. It was a weak, breathy murmur. Everyone in the room fell silent, straining to hear, Sarah, Shh. The name was so faint it was almost lost. Dr. Evans in the observation room leaned closer to the glass, his brow furrowed. "Sarah. Who is Sarah?" The murmur came again, a little stronger this time, a sound of pure, paternal love cutting through the fog of anesthesia. "My Sarah. My girl." So proud, a shocked stillness descended over the operating room. Every head, except for Dr. Albright's and Amara's, turned toward the sound. Then, slowly, almost in unison, their eyes shifted from the patient on the table to the lead nurse standing beside him, Amara, in the observation room. Dr. Evans felt a jolt, like an electric current passing through his body. The pieces so random and insignificant before suddenly snapped together with an audible click in his brain. Sarah. That was the name he had seen on the patient's contact. Information sheet earlier, the emergency contact. Sarah Williams. He looked from the elderly, legendary surgeon on the table to the poised, stunningly competent nurse standing beside him. He thought of the hallway, the dismissive laugh, the cruel words, the diversity hire. It's the sweetheart who couldn't handle a code. Williams' nurse Sarah Williams. The world tilted on its axis. The blood drained from his face, leaving it pale and clammy. He felt a sickening lurch in his stomach, a hot, sour wave of nausea. He leaned a hand against the cold glass of the observation window to steady himself. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a catastrophe of his own making. He hadn't just insulted a random nurse. He had held the daughter of a medical god in contempt. He had sneered at a woman whose skills had just helped save that very god's life. The joke was on him, and it was the most terrifying, soul-crushing joke he had ever heard. The identity that had been revealed wasn't just hers. It was his own, ugly, ignorant, and now utterly ruined. The silence in the operating room was thick and heavy, a living thing that pressed in on everyone. The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound, a fragile, life-affirming pulse in the suffocating quiet. Dr. Albright finished the last suture, his movements slower now, deliberate and final. He stepped back, his shoulders slumping with a weary relief that seemed to pull the tension out of the entire room. "He's stable," he announced, his voice raspy. "Let's get him to recovery." "Excellent work, everyone." His eyes found Amara, and he gave her a small, genuine nod of respect. "I mean it. You were exceptional today." He still didn't know the half of it. To him, she was just a phenomenal nurse who had risen to an impossible occasion. Amara managed a weak smile in return. The first real expression that had crossed her face since the code had been called. Her professional mask was still in place, but it was cracked. The daughter was pushing her way back to the surface, her heart aching with a fierce protective love. As the anesthesiologist began to wake the patient more fully for transfer, Amara moved closer to the head of the table, her hand hovering just above her father's bandaged shoulder. She wanted to hold his hand, but she couldn't.
Here.
Not yet. In the observation room, Dr. Evans was frozen. His body felt like it was made of lead, his feet glued to the floor. The blood that had drained from his face moments before was now rushing back with a hot, shameful pulse that hammered in his ears. The scene on the other side of the glass, she had been watching with detached admiration minutes ago, was now a torturous display of his own ignorance and arrogance. He saw the way Dr. Albright deferred to Amara, the way the other nurses looked at her with a mixture of awe and respect. This was not the liability he had mocked. She was the cornerstone of the entire procedure. He felt a sickening lurch of vertigo, the floor seeming to drop away beneath him. His career, his reputation, his entire sense of self had been built on the foundation of his own perceived superiority. In the last few minutes, that foundation had been shattered into a million pieces. He had to do something. The thought was a desperate animal instinct. He had to fix this. He couldn't let it end like this. As the surgical team began to wheel the gurney out of the OR and toward the intensive care unit, Dr. Evans finally broke free from his paralysis. He stumbled out of the observation room and hurried down the hallway, his mind racing. He intercepted them just as they were waiting for the elevator. "Nurse Williams," he said, his voice sounding thin and reedy, a pathetic echo of its usual authoritative boom. He stopped them, and the small group turned to face him. Dr. Albright looked at him with a questioning, irritated glance. Amara simply stared, her expression unreadable. Her eyes were no longer the professional, neutral eyes of a nurse. They were the eyes of a daughter who had just heard her father speak her name from the brink of death, and they were filled with a cold, profound disappointment that was far more cutting than any anger could be. Dr. Evans swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry as sandpaper. I am so sorry," he stammered, the words feeling clumsy and foreign in his mouth. "For what I said earlier, in the hallway. I had no idea." It was inexcusable. It was disgusting. He was rambling, his composure completely gone, replaced by a raw, sputtering desperation. "I am just so sorry." For a long moment, Amara just looked at him. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. Her gaze was steady and clear, and it seemed to strip away every layer of his defense, leaving him exposed and raw. She saw not the brilliant surgeon, but the scared, small man hiding inside. "Doctor," she said finally, her voice low and steady, a stark contrast to his frantic plea, "you shouldn't have to know who my father is to treat a colleague with basic human decency. My identity was never the problem. Your character was—" The words landed with the quiet, final weight of a judge's gavel. They were simple, true, and absolutely devastating. There was no argument he could make, no excuse he could offer. She was right. He opened his mouth to say something more, but no words came. What could he possibly say? The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, breaking the tense silence. The team wheeled the gurney inside. As the doors slid shut, Amara gave him one last long look that said it was over. The next morning, Dr. Evans was summoned to a meeting with the hospital administration. He walked into the sterile conference room with a heavy sense of dread. But nothing could have prepared him for the scene that awaited him. Sitting at the head of the long table, looking frail but imposing in a hospital gown and a robe, was Dr. Alistair Williams. He was pale and had dark circles under his eyes, but his gaze was sharp and clear as a winter morning. Beside him sat Amara, her expression calm and resolute. And on the other side of them were the chief of staff, the CEO of the hospital, and Dr. Albright, whose face was like a storm cloud. Dr. Evans felt a fresh wave of nausea. He didn't even have to be told why he was there. He knew. The CEO, a woman with a severe haircut and an even more severe expression, got straight to the point. "Dr. Evans, we have received a formal complaint regarding your conduct and comments." A formal complaint. The words hung in the air, so sterile and yet so destructive. Dr. Alistair Williams spoke, his voice weaker than usual, but still carrying the weight of a lifetime of authority. "When I built this cardiac wing," he said, his eyes fixed on Dr. Evans, "I built it on one principle, that every single person who walks through those doors, from the world-renowned surgeon to the environmental services worker, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. I came here today to see that the principle I built my life's work on is being upheld." He paused, taking a slow breath. "Your comments about my daughter were not just an insult to her. They were an insult to every person who has ever been judged by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character. They were an insult to the very institution you swore an oath to serve. An investigation was launched immediately. It wasn't a quiet, internal affair. In a hospital as close-knit as St. Jude's, news traveled faster than a virus. The story of what Dr. Evans had said, and to whom he had said it, spread through the halls like wildfire. Whispers in the cafeteria became hushed conversations at the nurses' station. The awe he had once commanded was replaced by a mixture of contempt and pity. The junior residents who had once hung on his every word now avoided his gaze in the hallways. His prestigious fellowship, which he had considered a stepping stone to a permanent, high-profile position, was suspended pending the outcome of the review. Within a month, the investigation was concluded. The findings were damning. The hospital, facing a potential public relations nightmare and the moral outcry of one of its most beloved figures, made its decision. Dr. Evans was quietly let go. His contract was terminated, effective immediately. There was no big announcement, no dramatic firing. He was simply told to pack his things and leave. His name was removed from the surgical schedule. His parking pass was deactivated. His digital access codes were revoked. It was as if he had never been there. He left the hospital that day carrying a cardboard box with his personal belongings. The same way he had seen countless fired employees do over the years, he walked through the halls he had once ruled, his head down, unable to meet the eyes of anyone he passed. He saw the nurses talking in a cluster, and he knew they were talking about him. He heard a doctor's laugh in the distance. It sounded like the laugh from the hallway, mocking him in the end. His career wasn't destroyed by a surgical mistake or a malpractice suit. It was destroyed by a moment of casual, unthinking cruelty. It was destroyed by his own arrogance, by his belief that his intelligence gave him the right to judge the worth of others. He had been so focused on his own identity as a brilliant surgeon that he had failed to see the humanity in the people around him. And in the end, it was that failure, that fundamental lack of character, that truly revealed who he was. The identity that was exposed in that hospital wasn't Amara's. It was his own, and it was a ruin of his own making.